Now, our next segment will focus on leveraging opportunities to promote equality, and we welcome Carrie Exton, Deputy Director of the OECD Centre on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity, WISE for short. Carrie has extensive experience using data science to assess wellbeing in relation to public policy, and she's going to share some of the work she's been doing on social mobility, especially in the light of climate change. Hello, Carrie, and welcome to the Amundi World Investment Forum. Great to have you here.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
Now, to begin with, we have a special message from Matthias Cormann, Secretary General of the OECD, and I invite us to now take a quick look at this message.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts on fostering equality of opportunity in the current economic context. Equality of opportunity is a powerful guiding principle to help ensure our societies get the best out of the talent and the potential of individual citizens. The opportunity to get ahead and to build a better life based on merit, based on effort and skills, is at the heart of the democratic promise made to citizens in open, market-based democracies. And it is, of course, a matter of equity and fairness. However, equality of opportunity is not yet a reality. Over the years, our societies have become wealthier overall, but not always fairer. Our analysis of European OECD countries, for example, shows that socio-economic disadvantages in childhood translate to lower incomes in adulthood, with those facing the greatest socio-economic disadvantages growing up to earn as much as 20% less than those who experienced more favourable childhoods. Recent shocks have also had a disproportionate impact on those most vulnerable. During the COVID pandemic, disadvantaged students suffered more from school closures and could not easily switch to online learning, or not as easily switch to online learning. The consequences for economic growth and for labour productivity at a time when we actually face workforce shortages due to population ageing are significant. We estimate that childhood disadvantages affecting labour market outcomes cost European OECD countries on average 1.6% of GDP annually. The right policy mix then can turn these challenges into opportunities. The OECD Observatory on Social Mobility and Equal Opportunity, which we launched in November last year, is supporting the design of a better policy mix through three pillars. First, improving data collection to measure social mobility and equal opportunity and to analyse the underlying drivers, including education and job opportunities. Second, analysing how policies can help break down barriers to equal opportunity and social mobility, ranging from better public transportation to investing in quality early childhood education to improving skills to reduce gaps in productivity across regions. Third, identifying private sector best practice, identifying private sector practices which can help promote social mobility and equal opportunity, such as share ownership policies and equity and diversity policies in the workplace. The OECD and Amundi have partnered to advance this third pillar. Amundi supported the collection of new data in 27 OECD countries on people's expectations of governments and the private sector in providing equal opportunities. The data developed by this partnership will be used to prepare a series of policy briefs later this year, with recommendations on enhancing equality of opportunity in a way that is responsive to citizens' needs and priorities. We look forward to using these insights to support the design of better policies for a more dynamic, fairer more prosperous future, and ultimately better policies for better lives. Thank you.
Now, Carrie, as we've just heard the Secretary General of the OECD reiterating how much the organisation is committed to equality of opportunity, which I like that turn of phrase, and social mobility. But can you talk us through some of the headline findings and why they matter?
Sure. So I think the first really striking finding is simply the overall trend. If we look at income inequality over the last 30 years in OECD countries, generally it has increased. And social mobility has meanwhile stagnated or worsened. So the average disposable income of the richest 10% of the population is now around 9.5 times higher than that of the lowest 10% of the population. So that's up from 7 times 25 years ago. The 2008 global financial crisis reinforced these rising inequalities, but even during the times of global expansion, when we saw the good times in terms of the economy, we still saw that a lot of the benefits were being accrued at the top of the distribution rather than being shared equally throughout the distribution. We're also seeing that a large share of the population in OECD countries are worried about falling living standards. So almost 2/3 of working-age people in OECD countries are concerned about being less financially secure than their parents. An almost equal share is worried that their own children will have comparatively lower living standards than they themselves have. And we know that disadvantage is passed down from one generation to the next. So a child whose parents didn't complete secondary education has only a 15% chance of making it to university, compared to a 60% chance for their peers if one of their parents went through tertiary education. So the third thing to highlight here is that recent shocks have widened gaps in opportunities across the population. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, women, minorities, young adults, and children from low-income households saw a larger drop in their well-being than in other groups. So just to take one example, in European OECD countries, we saw the share of young people with symptoms of depression more than doubled in several OECD countries. In addition, we saw low-skilled workers at the front line of the pandemic. They had fewer chances to telework, they were more exposed to health risks, more exposed to job risks, and saw larger reductions in investment in things like training. So to wrap up, today, rising inflation and Russia's war against Ukraine are threatening the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. And here, we need to point out that low-income households are, of course, particularly exposed to cost of living pressures. They have fewer savings to fall back on, they usually have less room to change how they spend their money, and they spend more of their income on life's essentials like energy, food, and housing. So finally, financial insecurity is a persistent problem even in OECD countries. So on average, 41% of people in the bottom 40% of the income distribution have almost no buffer to protect them from financial shocks. So their liquid financial wealth is less than the equivalent of 3 weeks of their household income. So those households are really exposed right now.
So some important and critical and startling statistics there, and perhaps most startling of all is that the gap is widening. But in recent years, the OECD, and you kind of touched on it there, has taken a more holistic approach to monitoring inequality and social mobility, such as looking beyond income and incorporating other aspects of people's living standards, overall well-being, such as statistics on perception, opinions, and beliefs. You touched on a few of them there. Could you tell us why you've taken this particular route and how this approach contributes to a better understanding of this idea of equality of opportunity?
So inequalities beyond income are important for understanding the quality of people's lives, as well as their choices and their life chances. Our work on well-being, inclusion, and sustainability is partly a response to calls to go beyond GDP in how we measure the progress of societies. So GDP is, of course, a very, very useful measure of what's happening in the economy today, but it was never designed as a measure of welfare or of the progress of societies as a whole. So there are 3 particular limitations that our work is seeking to address here. First of all, GDP is an aggregate measure of the economy, so it can't tell us about the distribution, who benefits if there is GDP growth. Second, of course, GDP is a flow measure. It tells us nothing about the sustainability of growth, whether that's from an environmental perspective or indeed actually from an economic perspective. Finally, there are many things that people value, such as their health, their happiness, their care for one another, their social connectedness, and their personal safety. And these societal goods, they're not traded in markets, we're not very good at pricing them, and they're not reflected very well in our measures of market activity. The second reason for looking at income, beyond income inequalities to a broader range of inequalities, is that vulnerabilities in life are very often interlinked. So if you want to improve people's life chances, you need to understand how inequalities in one aspect of their lives can limit people's opportunities in other domains. If we take the example of health inequalities, both in terms of physical health and mental health, these shape people's educational opportunities, their working lives, and their social connectedness. Another example, educational disadvantage. This typically means lower salaries, but it actually also means shorter lives. So a 25-year-old with a university education can expect to live almost 8 years longer than someone with only a primary education. That's the figure for men. For women, it's slightly below at around 5 years. So moving on to the final part of the question in terms of perception data. So perceptions matter because how people feel affects the quality of their lives, of course. But perceptions also matter because they shape people's beliefs, their behaviors, and their choices. And when it comes to social mobility and inequalities, perception data can help us to better understand the types of actions that people would like to see policymakers and businesses take in order to promote equal opportunities. So 4 in 5 people in the OECD feel that income disparities are too large in their country. And actually, people are more concerned about income inequality when they think that hard work is not a factor in getting ahead in life. So there's a link here between how people are perceiving inequalities and how they're perceiving their social mobility. And these two things are reinforcing one another. We do not see, for example, that higher inequality is linked to higher social mobility, quite the inverse. People's support for specific policies depends on whether they perceive those policies to be effective. So people are less likely to demand more redistribution if they feel that the benefits system, for example, is mistargeted. They're also less likely to favour progressive taxation if they believe that petty corruption is widespread among public officials. Despite this, we see 4 in 5 people in the OECD think that government has a responsibility to reduce inequalities. So we're seeing both 80% of people think that income disparities are too high in their country, and 80% of those people think that the government has a responsibility to do something. So these barriers, these perception barriers in terms of what's effective in policy response, it's really important for us to understand those because we need to build public support for the type of measures that we think are most effective in reducing inequalities. And of course, this is something that it's very clear most people in OECD countries feel is really important.
Now, you touch on feelings there, mental health. It's not a topic we always talk about in an investor-focused conference. So I'll move on to my last question, though. Global efforts to mitigate climate change are having a significant impact on the world, with policies affecting some segments of society more than others. What are your thoughts on the just transition? We saw those words in the video, just transition, and the factors that policymakers need to consider in a context of already high inequality, as you've just spelled out.
So social and environmental outcomes are intrinsically linked. Improving environmental outcomes will actually have many benefits for people's overall well-being. But of course, the green transition is a major economic shift. And as we've seen in recent times, as I've already described, economic shocks very often hit the most vulnerable the hardest. So alongside the technical, the logistical, and the financing challenges that governments are facing to meet net zero, ensuring a just transition is also a top policy concern in OECD countries. This imperative is reinforced by the fact that poor environmental outcomes are already having a disproportionate impact on some of our most vulnerable groups. So if we take the example of health, air pollution globally is a leading cause of premature death, and it disproportionately affects certain groups, particularly the young, children under 5, and adults over 60. Within cities, the areas where the air quality is poorest often have more lower-income households living there. If we look at something like work and job quality, exposure to outdoor air pollution and climate change, climate risks differs across different job categories and across different skills levels. So things like more frequent heat waves, more extreme weather will particularly affect outdoor workers and workers in industries that are dependent on the functioning of ecosystems, so things like tourism, agriculture. Similarly, again, air pollution is likely to affect outdoor manual workers the most. So the just transition requires all sectors in society, governments, companies, other stakeholders, to systematically consider the interlinked structural and transboundary impacts of their policies, both on the environment and, of course, on society as a whole. And it's important to think about the just transition happening at multiple levels. So at the subnational, regional level, the green transition impacts certain communities more than others. Emissions, impacts, and vulnerabilities vary across territories within the same country, and governments need to implement a place-based and targeted approach to support those communities on the front line of this transition. Of course, also at the global level, the challenges of the green transition are toughest in emerging and developing countries, not only due to their immediate exposure to climate risks, but also due to the challenges of financing the just transition. Last word on this. Progress is being made to harmonize this concept of just transition. At the moment, I think it's still a little bit fuzzy, and I think countries, and especially companies, are actually differing in terms of the measurement and the implementation. So I think it's really important to try and build a common understanding, and I think that if we have a common set of metrics, this could really help us to galvanize action and improve accountability. So I think the public sector is important in this space, but of course the private sector has a really important role. We've seen business alliances like Business for Inclusive Growth, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, the World Council for Sustainable Development. These are all sharing good practices among members to help sort of move towards common definitions and metrics. In addition, the OECD is partnering with the UN Environment Programme to work with leading standard setters to develop an impact management platform. So this platform is aiming to equip businesses and investors with better tools and guidance on how to both measure and manage impact.
Thank you very much, Carrie Exton. And of course, it's exciting to hear that the OECD is partnering, of course, with Amundi to pool resources on such a crucial topic. Thank you very much for your time. And it makes